My heart. I was a lay minister for quite a long time before ordination. I'm a bricklayer by trade originally, so I was a brickie for 10 years. And I gather that brickies are a lot better looked after in Canada than they are here. It's not a well-paid job in this country, certainly not if you're honest. And I was really interested. I'd love to talk more another time, maybe, about the whole concept of the pioneer minister, or the pioneer missioner. I wrote a paper with some friends critiquing that term, which is widely used in the UK, because to me, the idea of a pioneer, it conjures up a very particular type of power relationship, both with Indigenous people in a place, but also with the land in a place as well. And I think that that relationship applies not only in contexts of historic colonialism, but it also applies in communities like mine, where, as a white British person, I'm in a tiny minority in my community. And also as a Christian, I'm in quite a small minority. It's about, well, it's between 70 and 80% Muslim, according to the census, our community. If you look in the schools, it's more like 99.5% Muslim, I think. So we have to grapple with these issues of colonialism in a slightly different but no less important way where we are. And so I guess I'll dive straight into that. Ian asked me to talk a bit about liberation theology within the context of mission and missioning. And I'm preparing a paper for a wee online conference about liberation theology on Saturday. And the first commitment that I'm talking about is that liberation theology has always been described as, particularly by Gustavo Gutierrez, as a second moment, or he said that liberation theology takes place after the sun goes down on your day of praxis. So with that in mind, rather than getting into lots of technical academic stuff about liberation theology, what I want to do is just share 3 stories with you from my time as a lay minister. Here in Luton, I was sent away to be a curate somewhere else for a few years, and I'm now back. But I'll share a few stories. I have permission to share these stories. And I normally would do this as a 2-hour session, and we're going to try and squeeze it into 30 minutes. So I might have to hop, skip, and jump a little bit. But I need to pick up my little boy from school in a while. So, yeah, it's currently 3:20 in the afternoon here in the UK. So let's jump straight in. If you want to cut me off and stop me at any point, please feel free to do so. But we will make sure there's a good long time for conversation at the end. Okay, if you can't see the slides, don't worry too much. It's not essential, and I can email them out afterwards. And there's one more bit that I need, which is that. There we go. Is it okay if we start with this short prayer? If you can see them, please do join in the words in bold. Let us pray. We are made in the likeness of eternal creativity. Another world is possible and on its way. Its insistence moves us into being and imagines for us worlds beyond our hopelessness. Another world is possible and on its way. We are made to collaborate with those around us to build deeper connections and sustainability around new ways of doing life together. Another world is possible and on its way. We are making space in our world for doubt and uncertainty by calling out fear and isolationism. Another world is possible and on its way. This is the truth about us. It always has been and always will be. A new world is both here and arriving. We wait for it, usher it, greet it as a hopeful people. Amen. I've already done a bit of introduction. There's just 3 questions really that I want to address in this time. And those 3 questions are, as a missioner, how should I or we speak and what should we say? What should we do and how should we do it? And what sort of sacred space are we being called to curate? So the first question, how should we speak and what should we say? During my first 8 years or so here in Luton, I became more and more aware of a major problem around violence affecting young people in our communities. All in the headlines at the time, you may have heard some of the stuff about so-called knife crime here in Luton. Actually, this knife crime is affecting children as young as 11 years old. We have one of the highest rates in the UK for this. And I've been involved in setting up a mentoring program for young men in particular that were being affected by this issue, although it's not exclusively young men. And I ran this project for a while, mentored quite a few young people myself, and it had very mixed results. And I ended up becoming a bit despondent about it all, especially when I realised that part of the motivation behind the project was that the charity was able to win a big pot of local authority funding to run it, and that quite a lot of that funding was just being fed back into this Christian charity's ongoing running costs. Especially when I figured that out, because I'd had to fundraise to pay myself to do it. But anyway, that's another story. One of the things that we did through this work was we listened to the common experiences of poverty, marginalisation, and experience of violence, which most, if not all, of the lads we were working with had experienced. And I realised that we were kidding ourselves if we thought we could undo 14 years of harm and many, many, many years of structural issues in 6 hours of mentoring sessions. And eventually the money ran out and the project was put on hold. Now, these experiences, alongside a little listening campaign that we did with young people and community groups, led me and some of the others involved to want to challenge some of the narratives going around about so-called knife crime. So we got some practitioners and some thinkers together, and with the support of a Red Letter Christians network that was emerging in the UK at the time, we decided to plan a simple action to draw attention to the issue and hopefully leading to some further work. We asked Bedfordshire Police to give us 1,000 knives out of local amnesty bins where people can put the knives to get rid of them. And we turned these into a sculpture of a phoenix. And alongside the phoenix, we made a short film with actors voicing some of the reflections that local young people and community members had made as part of our listening campaign. And we held a big peace vigil in the town, which included playing our little film on a big advertising mega screen in the local shopping mall, and then unveiling the sculpture on the steps of our town hall. We shared research which suggests poverty, marginalisation, and the experience of violence and cuts to youth funding led to increased rates of violence, which affects young people. Now, that morning, a young man had been stabbed over 20 times, a quarter of a mile from my front door, which brought a lot of heat to the day. And it was, I think he survived as far as I know, but it was an awful, awful day. So as a sort of prophetic act, we decided that we would paint our hands red as part of this ritual and this peace vigil, to express the idea that as a community, we have a shared responsibility to build a better world for our kids to grow up in, instead of doing the kind of blame game thing that the politicians were doing. We got quite a lot of media attention on the day, partly because of the awful event that had happened that morning. And we've used this sculpture to travel around. We've visited local schools and different things. We've done a few things on TV as well, talking about this issue, and it's still being used today. In my training as a community organiser, I learned some good evaluation questions, which I want to ask about this experience I had. One of the questions is, who did this help? Another question is, whose voices were heard in the mix of all of this? And then I had to ask myself a really difficult question, which was, while this was a worthy cause and some good had come of it, I had to ask, really, did anybody benefit from this day as much as I did? You know, I was on BBC News and the Sunday morning show, and, you know, it was all very impressive. And I had to think, actually, where were the young people being affected in all of this? I asked the question, what should we say? Of course, there's a huge amount of material that we as Christians can draw from in addressing injustice. In the Bible, we have the Minor Prophets, we have Luke's Gospel, the Magnificat is a particular favourite of mine. but I think there's always the question of how we should speak. I don't know if you're of a similar generation to me with evangelical trauma, but a common phrase that I used to hear as a young Christian was the idea of being a voice for the voiceless. And I'm coming to the conclusion that, as Arundhati Roy has said, there's actually no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. I found it really helpful to draw from different liberation theologies as I've reflected theologically on my own practice over the years, and those which challenge the church's continued colonising of some sorts of spaces. Sometimes the church silences the voices of lived experience when we try to tackle big issues. Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who is a major influencer of liberation theology, wrote, and I quote, "Any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. The means used are not important. To alienate human beings from their own decision-making is to change them into objects." I've often also reflected on Walter Brueggemann's idea in his excellent book on preaching. I mean, it's a bit different here in the Church of England because we are still the established church with the king as our sort of head figure. But I think it works elsewhere too in the West. The idea that as church leaders, we can end up becoming chaplains to power. And of course, the church and her clergy often took that role in the colonization of the majority world. But in many ways, I think the church still acts as chaplains to power today. Sometimes we end up propping up unjust systems. We end up silencing people with lived experience. We assume that our voices should be at the centre. And I think in that way, we fall into the same trap. What this often comes down to is the difference between social action and social justice. Social action means doing things for people without disrupting the systems which led to their poverty, marginalisation and oppression. Social justice means working and organising with people to dismantle the systems that cause all this. I don't know if this is so much of a thing in Canada. Does anybody have like a food bank in their church? Have a show of hands. I can see some nods. Yeah. I think food banks are really, really important. If people come hungry into the church, we don't like to turn them away or just give them a Gustavo Gutierrez book to go away with or something like that. But as a Christian who takes the Magnificat really seriously, I want to hope and to work for a world where we don't need food banks anymore. As liberation theologian Jose Miguel Benino would say, in the struggle for life and against death, theology must take sides. And as my favourite theologian, womanist theologian Monica Coleman says, there have to be ways that we can find of disrupting the status quo without ending up becoming coercive in the way that we do it, without abusing our power. We'll do questions at the end. I'll jump straight into this second question, which is what should we do and how should we do it? I want to make it clear that I have permission to share this story anonymously, and that the person at the centre of this experience, who's still a good friend today, gave me an audio clip of her experiences because I use this in training clergy here in the UK. She really wanted people to hear her story. She's really remarkable and articulate young woman. My wife Jenny and I got to know a young lady and her boys at church, and we were all there looking after our kids in what I call the dead teddy bear corner. I sincerely hope this is a uniquely English thing, but a lot of churches have this corner with like teddies and toys from 1978 that are all looking a bit worse for wear, and I always call it the dead teddy bear corner. Anyway, we'd learned that this young woman had become estranged from her family, had been through some really, really awful stuff with the father of her children, and that although she had left him, he was still kind of making their life a bit of a misery. And we talked about what support the church might be able to offer her. Now, I knew that from my work in the homelessness sector that legally speaking, because she didn't have access to a safe home, she was legally homeless by British law. And yet, despite this, and despite all of her incredible record keeping of all the things that had happened, nobody was helping her to get housed. So she asked if there was anything we in the church could do to help. So what we did was I arranged to meet a housing officer at the local council, or the city, you might call it, with her to do a bit of advocacy. I've learned over the years that advocacy can be very effective, but also very delicate. And it's a kind of relationship where we have to pay really close attention to power, particularly in resisting what some people have called a kind of white saviorism, where people try to take over other people's lives, taking away their power and their agency. And this can end up becoming abusive and controlling and harmful. And very sadly, my friend had experienced some of this kind of heavy shepherding and white saviorism from another leader in our local church. We gathered loads more evidence, and yet despite all this, the police refused to support her claim. Her doctor said it would take 4 to 6 weeks to write a letter of support and that she would have to pay for it. And eventually we met a council housing officer together, and they said all they could offer her was a place in a refuge, which was unsuitable for her children and would take them away from their local support network. And in that meeting, my friend was really, really upset. And she turned to me in tears and said, you know, I told you this was going to happen. I told you not to get my hopes up, that things could get better. And those words absolutely shattered me. And I couldn't even begin to imagine how she must have been feeling. We didn't give up there. With her permission, I contacted a couple of local politicians I'd met. Luton is quite a strange place. We're a very religious town, unlike the rest of Britain. We have quite a lot of religious people in local leadership, so I'd met quite a few local politicians through various faith activities and things like that. And I basically wrote to these two local politicians I knew who were both Christians, and said that the council was not meeting its legal duty and therefore putting this woman and her children at risk. And we'd agreed that they had 48 hours to do something about it before we took the story to the local news media, to the press. One of the things I've learned in parish ministry and in kind of mission and missioning is that it's really good to get to know local power holders in your area, people with influence, people who can open doors. But it's really important to keep a bit of critical distance so that you can put pressure on those people when you need to and when you uncover injustice. Now, within a few hours of sending that email, despite the fact my friend had been on a waiting list for a few years to get rehoused, within a few hours, the director of housing in the city contacted me and pretty much immediately got her rehoused after we'd kind of threatened to expose them to the press. And what that taught me, amongst many other things, was some of the privilege that goes with being a Christian minister, being part of a prominent church at the time. And that led me into a whole thing of wrestling with my white privilege, my male privilege, and figuring out my own identity and stuff too, but that's for another time. To cut a long story short, it had a happy ending. She's really happily housed with their 2 children. We're still in regular contact, and they're flourishing. They're doing great. All they needed was a decent home for living that they were legally entitled to under law. They just weren't being given it. But I ended up spending my whole master's degree dissertation trying to reflect theologically and unpack on that story, on the different dynamics of power and identity. She is a woman of Bengali heritage, but being a Christian convert, she was being treated in a particular way and ignored in a particular way. There was loads of stuff to unpack with that together. I learned there were many things I could have done a lot better. I learned from a lot of my mistakes in that situation. And there was certainly a lot of things that the local church could have done an awful lot better. And in a second, I want to play you a little clip of my friend talking about her experiences in the church, which I hope will be valuable, and I hope you'll be able to hear it okay. I might actually share screen for that because it makes the audio tend to work better. I'm going to skip through this next slide, though, for the sake of time. Right, let's see if I can do a little screen share. We want this one, and we want share sound. When I hit play, if it doesn't seem to be working, just do the universal sign for it's not working properly.
Say, for example, sort of when we'd had church service, and they asked the kids to come up and help out with such and such tasks. It seems to always, like, it was always sort of the same kids of, the same family, and you sort of know that those people come from sort of like I guess like a holy background, or they're married, and yeah, sort of like perfect, if you know what I mean. Well, that's how it felt to sort of me, and I sort of felt like, oh well, of course I'm not perfect, or I come from such and such a background, so I guess they won't really ask me to come up and share a bit of my story or my journey with God, or or things like that. I felt kind of left out in a way, because although I felt included, I did sort of feel sort of excluded at the same time. It was sort of like, oh, God doesn't condemn you, but then at the same time I did feel like, well, actually I feel slightly condemned in a way, or yeah, I didn't really feel super a part of the family in a sense, if that makes sense.
I hope you could hear that okay. Would anybody like to share anything that stood out in what my friend just said? Just unmute yourself and jump in.
For me, it's implied sense of shaming, a sense of not being good enough. Other responses, guys?
Well, it sounded like the church wasn't necessarily like even trying to exclude her, but it's sort of the system and like a kind of habitual way of living that like doesn't actively include. And if you don't actively include, then you end up excluding or making people feel excluded, which I think is, scary to think about, but something to be aware of.
I think that's so true, yeah. And I think this church would have seen themselves as being like the best at making people feel included and the best at working with marginalized people. I've heard them talk about their ministry in that way. And yet, because they didn't necessarily listen well, they didn't realize how the unspoken stuff was being heard by people. Yeah, it's a really good observation, Susie. Thank you.
Yeah, I just sort of jumping on the back of that too. It feels like what my own experience in that sort of like pride of being very welcoming or whatever. You often don't see yourself actually in need of that, so it's that really one-way street, right? If you are the subject offering the welcome and all this wonderfulness, but it's always looking for an object when you're actually not the one. You misread Jesus' parable, right, and see that you're actually the one in the ditch in need of the neighbor, right? The neighbor. So
yeah, I hear you.
How to get in the ditch really is one of the thoughts I've been having lately.
Yeah, I mean that's excellent. One of my favorite little book chapters from a while ago is called "What Would Zacchaeus Do?" And it's a kind of critique of the way that that white Christians particularly seem to have a struggle with when we read stories about Jesus. We typically put ourselves in Jesus' shoes. And the idea of this chapter, "What would Zacchaeus do?" is that actually many times those of us who are in positions of ministry and authority in the church have a lot more in common with Zacchaeus than we do with Jesus. We might be people who have our own power, or at the very least we're related to an institution that has at times been abusive and powerful and wealthy. Yeah, thanks, Rob, for that. That's really helpful. We'll carry on to the final story, and then we'll carry on chatting afterwards. Here we go. Final question. It's always really important, I think, to remember I'm someone who's deeply passionate about how churches can engage in social justice, but it's important to remember that we're not qualified social workers, and that's not what we're supposed to be. Part of our job as ministers, whether lay or ordained, is to curate sacred spaces where people encounter God, and where we encounter God together with others. So what sort of sacred space are we being called to curate? Let me go back one, actually. This is a shorter story, and then we'll be done in a few minutes. So me and my wife, Jenny, realised over the years that often the church struggles to welcome some of our freaky mates, and quite often struggles to welcome us as well. In my days as a biker, I used to go into a lot of biker clubhouses, and these places would have like heavy bomb-proof doors. There'd be heavy metal music playing. There'd be all these symbols and artwork about hell and the devil and all sorts of things like that. One bar I used to go into regularly had a little glass jar with what looked like a pickled human thumb behind the bar, but I never had the guts to ask whether that's what it was or not. But anyway, imagine how you might personally feel going into an environment like that, with all that scary imagery and scary environment, unfamiliar language, unfamiliar music. How would you feel? You know, would you feel uncomfortable? Would you feel maybe afraid? Would you be thinking, I just want to get out of here as quickly as possible? In my experience, that is how more and more people feel when they walk into a church building. It's a big, dark place often, with heavy doors. There's artwork displaying somebody being tortured to death everywhere. There's strange music. There's unfamiliar language and culture. And a lot of people in our cultures today don't relate to it very well. So in response to that, there's been a few times over the years that we've experimented with creating different spaces for worship and community that we thought might help break down some of those barriers. And one project was in the function room above a local pub here in Luton. It's actually one of the roughest pubs in Luton. And we got together with a group of other Christians who wanted to create something they felt more comfortable to invite their friends to. And it was a really kind of interesting mix of things. We mixed just time to socialize with liturgy, mixed with electronic music and ritual. And for a while, it was really beautiful and really fun. And one evening, a young lady that we knew from my wife's years of working in a charity supporting sex workers showed up to our service. And she'd seen this kind of cutesy little sign covered in fairy lights that we used to put outside the function room to welcome people, and had wandered up. And over the years of volunteering alongside my other half, I'd gotten to know this lady in particular, and I had a real kind of particular connection and rapport with this person, and more so than many of the other women that we work with. She just really had something about her. She was a really special person. And we had a really lovely chat and caught up with her. We hadn't seen her for years. We reassured her she was very welcome to come to this service. Anytime she saw the little cute sign with the fairy lights outside, she was very welcome to come in and take part. And then just after she left to go and do whatever it was she was going to do, one of the other leaders of the group came over to us and said, "Well done for getting rid of her so quickly." And we were absolutely heartbroken by that. And not long after that happened, this project began to fall apart. We found other leaders were saying that they wanted to do something that was more aimed at like young professionals and students, and that their kind of cool hipster friends would be put off if there were older people or street people there. And that we really should be turning those sorts of people away at the door because, you know, there were other places that were more suitable for them. Now, I learned a really important lesson through that experience, which is that you can only really lead people as far as they want to go. My friend Johnny says you can only lead people into the adjacent possible. I don't know if any of you are nerds like me and you like playing like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. But if you imagine a kind of a board game of dungeon crawling, you know, in one room, the doors only go to the next room. metaphorically speaking. If the place you want to go to is like 8-10 doors away, you have to go on that journey. You can't just kind of skip the steps with people. And this dream, this idea that a few of us that started this group had for the rest of the group was just so far beyond what they wanted or what they were imagining. It just didn't work. Now, when I was, do you have curates in the Church of Canada? Is that what you call them when you're like your trainee priest? Yeah. So I did my 3 years curacy at a very historic church. And it was like the county church where the Queen and King's representatives would come once a year and their funny hats and swords and weird stuff like that. And what I learned serving my curacy in that place is that we often build these boundaries around our sacred spaces. In the history of Church of England architecture, you'd have these rood screens built, which were sort of supposed to separate the clergy and their magic hands away from all the plebs in the congregation. Now, boundaries, of course, are a really good thing. They can help keep people safe. But also I found that boundaries can sometimes keep Jesus out when he turns up in disguises which disturb our privilege. Reflecting on the way that people of colour can be excluded from supposedly communal spaces, Black theologian Amaya Jones Armstrong wrote the following: "The interruptive politics of Black Lives Matter and a host of other movements seeking to call attention to the precarity that attends various marginalised forms of life along colour lines, border lines and kinship lines might best be thought of as spirited interruptions which seek to prompt contemplation. In contemplating the structures and practices that give rise to the inequalities and violence, we are met with the need to interrupt the status quo and confront Christianity's failures to live justly and walk humbly with our God and our neighbour. We can take the openings these interruptions make available to contemplate the space they provide for rethinking the common good." Now, my doctoral research, if I ever finish it, is looking at the ways that the Holy Spirit addresses these kinds of boundaries and leads us sometimes beyond them. And I'm fascinated to think about the work of the Spirit in the world in that way. I'm going to stop my presentation there to make sure we've got plenty of time to chat. So if I do this and this, there we go. So we can just have some questions and discussion, and people feel free to share your own experiences, what resonated, what didn't resonate with you. Yeah, we have about half an hour.
Thanks, Lou. That's really great. So what issues, things, just maybe start with clarifications, or if there was anything within what Luke's just said that would be helpful just to describe, because I think there's a bit of a translation between Canada and the UK, but similar themes. So anything arise from what we've just heard that people would like to raise?
Can you share the term you used for you can only really lead people as far as they want to go, the adjacent possible?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the author who came up with that concept, but I'm sure if you Google it, yeah, the adjacent possible. I found that in terms of like reflecting on church leadership, I found that metaphor really helpful.
Yes, yeah, like I'm Ian's colleague at the diocese, and my role is working with parishes, and sometimes I feel like yeah, if you try to get them 10 steps ahead, there's a shutdown, right? But like, how do you, I like the idea of the adjacent possible. It's a term I appreciate you sharing, because yeah, it gives new framework for how to do my work or to think about it.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, yes, indeed. It's so important. I often, when I'm teaching ordinands, remind them that they might want to change the world, but the church will crucify them for changing the notice sheet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I really like that adjacent possible too, because I just wonder if you are just reflecting on the fresh expressions or the kind of contextual mission process. I really like that, where you've got the circles of listening, loving service, building community, exploring discipleship, and then developing contextual worship. It seems to me that that is that journey which has to be dictated by the people in terms of their experience of the Spirit through those various spaces. So I really like that, because it's then curating those opportunities, I like that language, and the sense that we're getting out of the way of God and allowing that to be an interaction between people and the Spirit. So I really like that, how that just comes behind this idea that we can't force it. We can't try to, I think how people try to manipulate through discipleship courses and all the rest of it. It takes it away from that to a kind of that process. And it just seems to, for me, just reinforces how important that missional process is. Does that resonate, Luke? Keen to hear what you think about that as you go through the whole pioneer thing and all that.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think I always think of a lovely sermon by the late Brennan Manning, where he says that the God of so many Christians is a God who is just too small for me. And so as I sort of go through these sorts of processes, as I'm 6 months in post back here now, I want to believe in a really, really, really big God, who is already present and at work in the lives of everybody who I meet, who comes through our doors. And so as we sort of go on this journey together, I guess it's having a slight recklessness to your faith in saying, this might not look like anything that I want it to look like. This, I mean, in our case, to get any funding to do anything, there's some quite strict frameworks of what is considered success and what isn't. And sometimes it's thinking like, how can we disrupt our idea of what success looks like, by allowing life to break forth and liberation to break forth. But it's not easy.
I'm wondering about those who are gathered here coming from a non-white British or British settler background respond to this. So I'm thinking Garfield and Jing, how you're responding to that coming from your perspective, and Susie coming from a Korean Canadian perspective, about how this relates to how you're experiencing the church and your experience of pioneering. Because the one thing I do know about being a missionary is incredibly lonely at times. So it'd be interesting, in Luke, about how you follow through this commitment to process and not just get overwhelmed, because I think that's one of the challenges, is that we get overwhelmed with the difficulty of the way things are, and the sense that often as missioners we're quite isolated. Interesting.
Yeah, let me know if you figure that one out.
Responses from people here?
Yeah, my name is Garfield. I'm the missioner here, ordained missioner. I've been doing this for a couple of years, but basically it's mumbling, finding out how to do it. But for the the newcomers, different language, different races, step into the church. Yeah, I share the feelings of different normals, different language. Very, for a lot of people, I find that it's really challenging. They feel it's home, like a spiritual home. Find a place of settle down. Most of the time they're exploring, and I think that the exploring time, maybe hanging there for a long time, they feel more comfortable. You visit them, go into their house, and sitting in the coffee place. So that's part of my work. I spend a lot of the out of church, I think, in the last few years. But eventually, I think for me, my role is I was welcomed. I think one of the touchiest sermon I heard, not sermon, sister welcomed me to the church. She hugged me, tell me you are home. And the words strike my heart. So basically, I mentioned that you are home to the newcomers, I think 100 times a year, at least for now practice. I think keep mentioning them, this is a place, it's your place, not others. You are part of this. You are welcome to be part of this. But I do share the feelings of for a lot of immigrants, newcomers, ACs, non-church, D-church. They had the impression of the church of a heavy door, of a religion, and all these things. I need to be it's calm down and be very peaceful, be kind of that feelings. So that's I think that's resonated in my I think it's a ministry and also many people. Yeah.
Thanks, Garfield. Other responses and just a reflection?
I was interested by the dissolution of that church that met in the pub after they sort of, one of the leaders rejected, I guess, the least of these. And I have like, I'd like to hear more about that, but I'd also like to like confess to something, which is that I've been struggling with this a lot because like millennial hipsters need Jesus too. And then but like you can't meet Jesus when you're just with people that are similar to you. So how do you lead these privileged people, to like get in the shoes of Zacchaeus and meet Jesus? And part of the context of thinking about this is like one day many years ago, I noticed that Jesus hung out with sinners, but also tax collectors, and tax collectors were kind of like the most privileged assholes in the society. And I'm just curious about how like Jesus was able to sit sinners and tax collectors down in the same table, because I think it's easier to like hang out with tax collectors and then afterwards hang out with sinners, but then to hang out with all of them together, like have you ever had success in sort of curating that kind of table, and like what was involved in doing that? Those are some of my questions.
Absolutely fantastic question, Susie, and I wouldn't even dare to say that I've figured that out. It's worth pointing out that the whole phrase sinners and tax collectors was mostly used by the people that wanted Jesus killed, and I think we need to be realistic about that. And in my own day-to-day this week, I'll come across all ends. We had our Minister of Parliament visit the other day. We have people really troubled knocking on the vicarage door at 10 o'clock at night. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that. And I think you're absolutely right that hipster millennials and beyond, myself being an elder hipster millennial, need Jesus too. I certainly do. But for me, part of the journey over many years is the experience of being evangelized by the poor and the excluded and the oppressed. And that took me a long time. I suppose the problem is with the kind of pressure, I don't know whether this translates, but here it feels like most of the resources pointed towards the pressure of getting these hipster millennials into church. And then you get caught in the kind of service delivery thing because they have high expectations. They want something good and polished and cool. And you end up doing like dollar store Hillsong if you're not careful. So I think there is a real challenge there. How do we now? I think if you create opportunities in your church, people like to feel like they're doing something useful in the world. If you create opportunities for people to collaborate on making the world a better place, I found that sometimes that can work. But there are those dangers of the kind of colonialism of space and paternalism and all of that are there. And I have to know that they're in me. Of course, they're in me. They're in my DNA. So these are the things that we wrestle with. And I think the other thing that's, I kind of skipped over this due to time, in talking about kind of borders and boundaries around space, all of us are complex selves, aren't we? And we have complex bits and bobs that make up the intersections of who we are. So for me, a big part of it has been wrestling with and navigating my own sense of identity and self, and the way that the color of my skin and my gender opens some doors to me, but then my social class and my sexuality and other parts of me slam some doors in my face. But that to borrow a metaphor from the trans community, some of us can be sort of passing and just sort of just about okay to the institution or to whoever, whereas other of us will never have that luxury. And so we have to move beyond the sense of the missioner or the priest or the practitioner as assumed as the default of having privilege, but also we can't be overly romantic and think that we're all going to be like Jesus and John the Baptist. So I think there's a lot of complexity there, and the only thing I can say in all that is get a good spiritual director to work through this stuff with, to be really practical, because this is all lifelong journey stuff, I think, and trusting in what the Spirit is doing. But we can't fall into that kind of consumer trap of church, which many churches fall into, because the privileged are always going to win out if you do that. The privileged are always going to squeeze out everybody else because they're the ones who bring the money. Yeah, we hear all these narratives all the time. I have the cure of 23,000 souls in my parish. We are the most deprived town in Britain, have the highest child poverty outside of London. And the kind of the resources you get sent by the diocese, just get someone in your congregation to develop your website, or just increase your giving, or we can give you a discount on a like a contactless card reader. And you just think, those people don't live here. We don't have those people in our congregation, because there's just this assumption of who's in the room. Yeah, I mean, that is a particular problem in the Church of England, but I would hazard a guess that in all and most of the Anglophone world, that is probably a problem as well. The Anglophone and the Anglican world.
I'm just wondering, Antonio, how you're thinking about this in regard to the migrant farm workers, because I think some of this you have deliberately done in terms of not being a service provider, but how do you, I'd be interested to hear, Antonio, about how you've been thinking about this in the context of migrant farm workers.
Well, I am definitely a liberation theology Gutierrez disciple, Sobrino, and the others in Latin America. In my school, my seminary is a liberation theology school in Puerto Rico. So I'm, liberation theology is practice, and in my world here in the Niagara region, it's a constant. Is a constant teaching and letting people of privilege, moving people of privilege, the dominant culture, moving them from the charity mode and the handout mode to bringing them to a journey of hospitality and connecting with the least among us, or the different among us. Migrant farm workers come to work, and they come to work hard in the Canadian fields. They come to do work that Canadians don't want to do. So they uphold the dignity by coming to do a dignified labor. Without them, we would not have food on our tables. But yes, my experience here, even with the diocesan resources, it's sometimes that you are constantly asking, keeping up on my website, migrant workers, farmers website. I don't have the expertise for the software, nor any of my migrant farm workers that come to make community during our activities in our Eucharist. So yeah, it's a constant. I could ask around, please. Can you do the update and keep our web page not stale? It's an uphill battle. Do it yourself or survive. The same thing with although our ministry is well known within the diocese. I'm sure many of the congregations know about migrant farm workers and the ministry that's being done, but the financial commitment of the diocese outside the stipend for myself and the other missionary, outside of our stipend, the financial commitment is zero. All our financial support is grant. I have to be knocking and doing grant proposal and to be able to get necessary funds to do ministry. So yes, it's a constant. For me, it's education, letting the dominant folks, the ones who have privilege and don't realize that they are privileged, that our world is a constant struggle, even for ordained a priest of color and being an immigrant myself, a new arrival, it's a struggle. My experience to be able to make community with the migrant workers that we make community, even on my side, I'm not in a position of privilege. It's a constant struggle to do what's being done here in the diocese.
Can I ask you a question, Antonio? If you
Sure.
could, if you could trade all that for a comfy office job tomorrow, would you do it?
Well, can you repeat that?
If you could trade all of that for a comfortable, well-paid office job tomorrow, would you take it?
No, not at all. No. And I've taken hits, for being the prophetic voice, and being able to channel the voice of non-English speakers, and to be able to support. No, I would never change. I would never give up what God has called me to do, and. Unpopular at times, with some that kind of resist when they hear my voice, or as I say things, and that I will not stop what I say or do. Yes, it makes people uncomfortable, and at times even I feel comfortable because they're going to say, "Oh, here he comes again." But no, I wouldn't. I would not change my job for no, not at all. I am very I am very grateful, and I have been so blessed by the people that we are a blessing to. I am just on a daily basis. I'm just blessed, blessed, and joy, and learn the commitment to be able to survive one day at a time. And no, I wouldn't change. No, not at all. I wouldn't change this for a Wall Street position tomorrow morning. No, not at all.
Hurrah.
Thank you so much, Antonio. I mean, all I can say is solidarity with you, brother. I hear that. I hear the feeling of the air going out of the room, because people are like, "Oh God, what's he going to say now?" And it, like it or not, certainly the experience here is that most of the metrics on which we operate, whether it's in the church or the charity sector, they're capitalist metrics, and therefore the lives of the kind of people that you're talking about serving amongst will never factor in the same way in the spreadsheets. You can't capture that in a spreadsheet what you're doing, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So I suppose the bit I didn't cover due to time, I always ask people the question, what's your why? Having had the experience of burying people who I let down, I've learned that you need to keep a pretty strong focus on why you are doing the ministry that you feel called to, how you will sustain it, how you will continue to find joy somewhere. Because sometimes it's amazing, as you've described, Antonio, but I can tell from you that there is a cost, and there's always a cost to all of us in doing this stuff. I had a full head of hair when I started ministry, so I think there is a real question. When I was commissioned as a lay worker by the Bishop of Reading, as he was then, he had three sort of charges that he gave to us, which were be real, be disruptive, and stay well. And I thought that was three really good pieces of advice, and particularly the stay well, because I've seen a lot of people burn out.
And he's now the Archbishop of York, so that's great. If it's the same Bishop of Reading.
No, different one.
Okay.
This was a few years back.
Look, I've got one particular question, I think, because
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about who's in the room here. So we've got, what advice would you give in terms of how to hold on to this kind of liberation theology perspectives as we move through to trying to do some things? So Susie and Mike are trying to develop a space for those who've become de-churched in terms of a mission and a mixed ecology mission. We've got Garfield and a little bit Jing in the kind of mission acts, which is particularly to Mandarin speakers, about how to develop a bilingual service in a church space which is very not that, and that's a difficult, in a quite privileged place. Got Antonio setting up, moving on to work with partners to start doing more services in Spanish for migrant farm workers. And we've got Rob, who's got the challenge of engaging with kind of younger people, largely being de-churched, but a few unchurched, and then using the early Sunday morning Eucharist as formational. So in all of those very different spaces with different needs, different contexts, what principles do you think, in terms of liberation theology, us as missioners should hold on to?
So I suppose there's kind of three principles from liberation theology, which is really simple, old school Gutierrez stuff, that are three kind of commitments to what it means to do liberation theology for me. First one, as I mentioned earlier, is that liberation theology means doing theology after the sun sets. Our theology is reflecting on our praxis. It's not just pie in the sky when you die. It's thinking about real practical stuff among people who are oppressed in a variety of ways. And I would consider many of my de-churched friends are people who have been oppressed and have been spiritually abused in often horrific ways. The second commitment is that liberation theology isn't just about describing the world, but about transforming it. And there's something about taking part in the transforming work of the Holy Spirit in the world. It's where I find a lot of help from Eastern Orthodox theology, which says the idea that the Holy Spirit is raising up all of creation as the elements of one big Eucharist, whereby we're all lifted up by the Spirit to be transformed into the life of God and to take part in the life of God. And so I try to remember that what the Spirit is leading us to do is to be part of that big world transformation. So I mean, we planted an orchard in our churchyard in Luton a couple of weeks ago, which seems like a stupid thing to do in the midst of a cost of living crisis and everything else. But people connected with this idea of, in this overdeveloped, overly urbanized concrete jungle, that we were planting fruit trees as a like, you know, in 5 years' time we're going to eat fruit together. And then finally, it's a commitment to the ecclesial body in some way. Now, I think that in the very early origins of both Fresh Expressions and liberation theology are in the base ecclesial communities that came out of Latin America. Now, some people critique how base they really were. I do believe, though, that it is possible to form spiritual communities today. And I think if you form spiritual communities that are really committed to being part of that transformation in the world, that are really committed to listening, that are really committed to discerning what the Spirit is doing, that are really committed to allow themselves to be transformed and allow their relationships to be transformed, I think you can find some delicate beauty. I guess my one piece of advice is, and I always tell this story when I teach on this stuff. Has anybody here heard of Saul Alinsky, the godfather of community organising? Broad-based community organising. He was a guy in Chicago who was involved in all kinds of different change movements in the US and elsewhere. But he talks about how the Catholic seminarians from the local college came to visit him just before their ordination for some training in doing broad-based community organising. And they asked him a question, which was, you know, when we get ordained and get sent to work with some fusty old fart of a priest who's not going to let us do any of the fun stuff that we're passionate about, what are we going to do? And he said, the answer to that question is very, very, very easy. He said, when you're there in the cathedral about to be ordained, ask yourself the question, is my calling to be a priest or is my calling to be a bishop? And if you think you're not going to be able to change anything until you get like the power and the status and the position, you'll never do anything. If you're committed to just being who you are and where you are and being part of that change and transformation, it will just happen. And so I suppose I think that way. But I've given up on having a career in the Church of England, as people put it in that ugly way. And I suppose, you know, here we are in this sort of forgotten church that the diocese was trying to close down, and seeing beauty emerge from the ground. It's lovely at the moment. All the little crocuses and daffodils are starting to burst up through the soil in the church garden at the moment. And that feels like a real image for what's happening, is there's beauty and goodness and truth coming up out of the ground. And we're here to, you know, observe that and nurture that and water that. But that's never going to get you a 6-figure salary or anything else. You know, you might get a book deal out of it if you're lucky. But yeah, I suppose it's, what is your why? What's the why? Why are you doing this?
Thank you. That's been incredibly rich. I'm just aware that you've got to go pick up your son, so I'm not going to keep you too long here. I suppose on behalf of us all here in the Diocese of Niagara, thank you for your time. This has been really helpful.
My pleasure.
Would really love a copy of the slides, and then I can then circulate, would be really useful. And Luke, are you happy for people, if they got particular follow-up questions they wish they asked, to email you? Would that be all right?
Absolutely do. It took me 2 hours to catch up on my emails today, so I am a little bit slow at responding quite often. But please do get in touch or contact me through socials and stuff.
Right.
But it's been really lovely to meet you. I hope next time we can do it in person, because I've always wanted to go to Niagara.
That would be great if we could try. I just wanted to flag up something, he's been very quiet about it, but this is the book, if you can see that I can definitely recommend. I'm planning to get a copy for it for our little missioners' little library. But I think it's very, very helpful insights of some of the stuff that you heard today. So yeah, that is available if you want, but we'll get that in the library to share as well. Thank you, Luke.
God bless you all. Have a lovely rest of the day. See you soon. Take care.
See you. Okay. Bye-bye. Everybody else, you want to hang on just a minute, just to let you know what's happening. So the next one we'll meet in March. I will recirculate the date, but we're planning to meet up with the Bishop Graham Cray, who was at one stage the Archbishop's missionary and leader for Fresh Expressions. And he's going to be particularly talking to us about mixed ecology, which I know you've heard a bit from me already, but it'd be really good to hear from his perspective as one of the people that developed that idea within a parish and a mission context. So that'd be again the same sort of thing about him doing a short presentation and then come with space for questions. All right. So thank you very much. Hope that was helpful. I will make this available to watch again, so I will send you the link so you can watch again if you want to. All right. But for the moment, thank you and see you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.